Hi, my name is Sibai. I'm a second-year medical student, and today I'm going to be explaining tubular functions. Now, tubular functions is a pretty lengthy lecture, and I hope I simplify it enough for you guys to understand the concept. You guys can interrupt me if you have any questions, but try not to make it too much, just so it doesn't disrupt the flow of the entire lecture or lesson. Okay, so I've compiled a bunch of objectives for you guys to read. Honestly, Dr. Angelica, I've never had her and I never took tubular functions with her, but she was pretty like vague and she would explain very vague concepts and then go into detail later on. So I just kind of listed them out for you guys. You guys can go over this, but this is kind of the flow that I follow. It's the same as hers. Okay. To introduce the whole topic, what is a nephron? Now, a nephron is a unit of a kidney and is the unit of the kidneys. And what kidneys do essentially, they take the plasma, they filter this plasma, they throw away what you don't need, and they take and absorb beneficial things into the blood. And basically, I broke it down for you. I listed all the things you need to know. We're going to be talking about the proximal tubule today, and we're going to skip the loop of Henle because this is taken in a later on lecture. I think in the next lecture, urine dilation. So if you guys question why I skipped this, it's going to be covered with you guys later on. And I move on to the distal convoluted tubule along with the collected duct or the collecting duct. Okay. Now, these are some things or concepts that I kind of got confused in, and these are concepts that I go over a lot in this video. So you have to have a solid base or kind of like a solid concept in your head of these, basolateral and apical. And I'm going to take my time to explain both of them. Now, apical means it's basically facing, or the side of the cell is facing the tubular lumen. This is the apical side of the cell. Basolateral means that it faces the blood. And basolateral and blood kind of start with BB. So whenever you think of basolateral, or we say, oh, this channel is on the basolateral side of the cell, it just means that it's facing the blood. So keep that in mind, because these are terms I'm going to be using a lot throughout the lesson. And you guys kind of have to have a good understanding of this so you don't get confused later on. All right. The next concept is reabsorption and secretion. Now, reabsorption and secretion are pretty self-explanatory, and that's fine if you don't understand what they are, because this is why I wanted to revise them, because I got to this point in this lecture and I was like, what does this actually mean? So secretion just means that you're taking substances or water or whatever, and you're putting them into the tubular lumen, okay? So it's going from the blood into the tubular lumen. And now reabsorption just means you're reabsorbing it back into the blood. So how I like to remember it is reabsorption, B, blood. Anytime you hear reabsorption, this just means it's going back to the blood. Secretion sounds like excretion, which is urine. So that's a concept we all have to keep in mind because it's also something I'm going to be repeating all throughout the lecture. Okay. This is kind of easy. You guys took transcellular and paracellular in foundation, probably. But just to reiterate and just to repeat, for the sake of completion, and I just want you guys to be 100% comfortable with the knowledge I give you, transcellular just means it's going through the cell, all right? And paracellular, which just means it's going through two cells. So para and trans through. And transcellular is made up of two different kinds of transports. What I explained right here, there's primary active transport and secondary active transport. Now, primary active transport just means that it uses ATPase to, like it's the pump of this channel. This is where the energy comes from the hydrolyzation of the ATP molecule. And secondary active transport, now this is kind of an indirect use of energy. Indirect, what I mean by indirect is that typically Na, or like sodium, moves from areas of high concentration to low concentration. It follows an electrochemical grade. So usually this would have a low amount of sodium and this would have a high amount of sodium. All right. So what the secondary active transporters do is that they utilize this electrochemical grade and they follow in suit along with sodium. Okay. So it's kind of an indirect source of energy. What I I already mentioned this here. You guys can read this, but I already explained it. And an example of primary active transport is the popular or like famous sodium potassium ATPase pump. You guys heard this like 100 times probably, and you're going to learn this like 100 more times. Okay. And just an example of secondary active transport is sodium and glucose pumps. Okay. Now, any question with any of what I just explained, because these are the foundational concepts, and I just wanted to go through them quickly so we don't linger on them for too long. So any questions before we go into the kind of harder stuff? You can type if you don't want to talk. Okay, no one said anything. So I'm just going to assume everything's good. Okay, now, okay. When delving into the kidney, we have to understand that the kidney is very essential for maintaining homeostasis. Did anyone say anything? No questions. Perfect. Okay. Now, the kidney maintains homeostasis. It maintains the concentration in the urine, and it kind of balances out the concentrations of any ions in the urine and in the plasma. And when I mean plasma, I mean blood and interstitial fluid, like between the cells. Okay? So a concept that your professor explained was tubular fluid over plasma ratio. This is what TF over P stands for. Now, when I first saw this, our professor didn't go into that much detail, but she did, so I'm going to go into a lot of detail. And essentially what it is, it's a measure between the concentration between tubular fluid, the compartment, tubular fluid inside of the nephron. That's the tubular fluid that we're talking about, the fluid inside of the nephron, in comparison to the concentration of solute or whatever in the plasma. Okay, so as an overlook and as just like kind of a quick recap of everything we're going to talk about, when tubular fluid over plasma ratio is equal to 1, this essentially means that the substance inside of the tubular fluid, when I mean substance, I mean solute. So like glucose, sodium, anything, but not glucose. We're not talking about that. Actually, I'm going to keep it at just solute. When the solute inside of the tubular fluid moves at a rate proportional to water. So when this solute moves, water moves in the same proportion, in the same exact number. This is when this ratio equals 1. All right? And this is what I wrote down here. And if you don't understand that, that's completely fine. I'm going to go back and I'm going to explain this in detail. Okay, so when tubular fluid over plasma ratio equals less than 1, this means that the substance is moving at a faster rate than the water itself. And I'll give you an explanation on this too. And then the last one, when tubular fluid is the ratio is equal to less than 1, or no, more than 1, my bad. It's equal to more than 1. This means that water is being reabsorbed at a faster rate. Or the solute is being reabsorbed less. That's what it means. Okay, what does this mean? What does any of this mean? I have a scary slide for you, but I'm going to explain this. And later on, I can get any questions because this is kind of a confusing topic. So let's start from the beginning. We have tubular fluid and we have blood, okay? Now, this whole thing is a ratio of, solute to solvent, okay? So hypothetically, let's say you have 10 solute in tubular fluid and you have 10 solvent in tubular fluid, okay? And you have the exact same amount in blood, all right? So let's say that you have a substance that when 5 of the substance moves, 5 water moves into the plasma. This is what I meant by solute moves at the same ratio as water. So to apply this, after 5 went to here and 5 went to here, now you have 5 solute, 5 solvent, and over here 15 solute and 15 solvent. They're moving in the same ratio, in the same proportion to each other. So after you calculate all of that, 5 over 5 is still 1, and 15 over 15 15 over 15 is also 1. So inevitably, this whole ratio comes to a number of 1. And substances that move in the same proportion as water are sodium and chloride. And this is obvious, we know this. Sodium moves. When sodium moves, water follows. Okay, did everyone understand this concept? Because the rest of the examples are kind of the same thing. Any questions on this? Okay, I'll keep this open just in case anyone has any questions. Okay. Yes, when I say plasma, I mean blood and arterioles. Let me clarify. Okay, so this is Bowman's capsule, and these are the nephrons, all right? This is just a really bad drawing of it. These are the nephrons, and there's a bunch of blood vessels. There's a bunch of blood vessels all surrounded. It surrounds these nephron. It surrounds the nephron. Okay, so anytime I say plasma, I mean from the tubular fluid inside of here to the blood inside of these vessels that surround the nephron. Is that good? Perfect. Okay, so that's what I mean by plasma. All right. Another example of this that we just mentioned was when the ratio is less than 1. When does this happen? Now, we said that the previous one, it moves in proportion to. However, in this one, the solute moves in a bigger proportion, like in a bigger volume. It moves faster than water. Water isn't reabsorbed. It doesn't follow the solute in question. All right. So in this specific example, this is when solute is reabsorbed more than water. That's all that means. Okay. So I put it into math just so it's easier to, math isn't everyone's strong suit, I understand. So I hope the explanation and the numbers will help anyone who's confused about this topic. So you have the same amount of solute and solvent in each compartment, and instead of a proportional amount moving from tubular fluid to plasma, instead more solute moves. I'll write this down here. More solute moves. In this case, 8 solute, and only 2 water or solvent moves. Usually solute is what's inside of the solvent, so typically water. And in this case, the ratio over here is less than 1. And since TF is always on top, if this number is less than 1, then the whole entire fraction is going to be less than 1. Is that concept understood? If anyone has any questions, I'll answer them. Okay. And an example of this solute is glucose and amino acids. Glucose is always reabsorbed more than water, okay? And in this case specifically, glucose would be completely, like in glucose's case, it would be completely reabsorbed. So it looked like 0 and 20. And so the whole thing would be equal to, in fact, 0, not even less than 1. It'd be literally 0 because all of glucose is supposed to be reabsorbed in your nephrons. That's a topic we're going to bring up later in the lecture. So don't worry about that. I hope I didn't confuse anyone. Okay, last example. We're going to be talking about when, where is it? We're going to be talking about when TF over plasma is more than 1. Once again, we have these 2 compartments. So in this specific case, solutes travel or they cross the membrane at a slower rate than water. So actually, water is reabsorbed faster than solutes. Water is reabsorbed faster than solutes. So once again, you have the same amount of solute, the same amount of solvent in each compartment. Instead, this time, you have only 2 solutes being moved into the plasma, blood, in this case 2, and you have 8 solvents being moved into the plasma. So inevitably, this whole entire equation, 8 over 2 is just 4, and when 4 is above anything else, it's going to be more than 1. So therefore, the whole ratio is more than 1. And this is why solutes that are reabsorbed slower than water come out to a ratio more than 1. And examples of this are urea and creatinine. They're not reabsorbed at the same rate as water. Okay. This is kind of a tricky subject, so does anyone have any questions? Any questions? Okay. Can you repeat how we get the ratio? All right, so the ratio essentially is wait, I need black. Okay. TF over P in itself, tubular fluid isn't a ratio in itself. It's a ratio of solute over solvent. And the same is for plasma. So when there is a difference in solute over solvent, when they're not the exact same number, for example, in the first example, if they're not the exact same number, like 5 and 5 and 15 and 15, it's not going to come out to 1. Sometimes there will be more solute in the tubular fluid. Sometimes there would be more solute in the tubular fluid than solvent in the tubular fluid. So more solute stays, so it increases, so ratio becomes more than 1. Yes, more solute stays in the tubular fluid, so it becomes more than 1. That's exactly right. More solute stays back in the tubular fluid. It all depends. The entire ratio depends on how much solute is in the tubular fluid. So if there's more in the tubular fluid, it will be more than 1. But if there's less in the tubular fluid, then it will be less than 1. Does that make sense? Perfect. Hey, did you get it? I can explain again. I want you guys to completely understand this because this is pretty important. Okay. I'll go back to this later on if you guys need to, but I'll continue for now. Okay. Now, we just explained how certain substances are reabsorbed. Can you do the numbers in the last course? Wait. Okay. Last one more time. Just for the sake of time, I don't want this to be like 2 hours long. Okay, so there's 10 solvent and 10 solute in tubular fluid. We already made sure that there's the same amount of solute and solvent in both not concentrations, compartments, in tubular fluid and in blood. Now, what determines tubular fluid over plasma ratio is whether or not there's more solute in the tubular fluid or more solute in the plasma. In this case, there is more solute in the tubular fluid because not as much gets reabsorbed. See, now only 2 solutes get reabsorbed into the plasma, which is the blood, and only an 8 solvents get reabsorbed into the blood. Therefore, since there's more concentration of tubular fluid, since the tubular fluid is more concentrated, the whole thing would equal more than 1 because not as much got reabsorbed back into the blood. Is that all good? I can answer this again at the end if you're still confused. Okay, perfect. Okay, we just talked about how substances are reabsorbed at different rates than water, but now we're going to dip into something called transport maximum. Now, stay with me because this is kind of confusing and make it confusing, but the kidney is made up of nephrons, and nephrons have 100 million types of channels. They have so many channels that are required to reabsorb sodium, chloride, glucose, amino acids, all of these. And there is a point at which all of these channels are working and you don't have any more channels left. What does that mean? Specifically, in this case, we're going to be talking about glucose. Glucose is the example Dr. Angelica used, so I'm going to use it. Also, it's the easiest. So glucose has a finite, which just means a limited amount of channels. We don't have 100 million channels of glucose in our kidneys. So there is a point at which all of the channels are going to be saturated. Saturated also means like all of the channels are working at the same time. So all these channels have all of this glucose and they're handling it. So there will be a point where there's not enough channels to further reabsorb the glucose. If I lost you, I'll re-explain with this graph. So for example, when all of the plasma is initially being filtered through Bowman's capsule, it represents this line. You see this line that's dotted? It represents this line. It's filtering linearly. It's endlessly until whenever it stops filtering. But This line is the reabsorption of glucose in your nephrons. So just to reiterate, your nephrons can reabsorb glucose. Like that's one of its functions. So when it has the channels to reabsorb glucose, there is a point where it does reabsorb at the same rate as what's being filtered through the Bowman's capsule. But there is also a point in time where it doesn't have enough channels. Not enough channels, but rather the channels start to get less and less, and its ability to reabsorb glucose becomes worse and worse. And this is exactly what this means, okay? So what essentially transport maximum means is the maximum amount of a given solute that can be transported per minute by renal tubules. A mouthful. It literally just means the maximum reabsorption rate of a certain substance, in this case, glucose, okay? And so all the channels in the nephrons inevitably get, I keep saying inevitably just means like they do end up getting saturated, all right? So right over here, this is when glucose would be reabsorbing, everything's good. They have enough channels, but at this point, this is the point where the channels start to get saturated and there's not enough channels. And this is what this curve means. At this plateau means that all of the channels in your kidneys are saturated and they're all working at their full capacity and you can't reabsorb any more glucose. So this line is what transport maximum is equal to. I'll write it down here, right over here. This is transport maximum, and specifically the number is 375, okay? Does everyone get this point? Because we're gonna need it to build up on the pieces of information we're gonna learn on later. Okay, no one said anything, I'll continue. So now that we understood what transport maximum is, what is threshold concentration? So no more than 375 glucose can get absorbed. Yes, exactly. That is the point. That is the rate at which glucose can be reabsorbed without being excreted, or not abundantly excreted. 375. Does that make sense? Yeah, okay. You got the point. All right. Threshold concentration. Threshold concentration is pretty, like, you can confuse it with transport maximum, but I'm going to explain why it's not. Threshold concentration only refers to reabsorption in substances. What does that mean? Again, let's use glucose as an example. Now, this is the point at which glucose, all of the channels are entirely saturated. There's not a single channel in your kidney that has the capacity to take up more glucose, all right? But there's a certain point in which glucose is going to be seen in the urine, okay? This is the threshold maximum, all right? Let me draw this. This is transport maximum. This is the threshold concentration, okay? Right over here at 200. Transport threshold concentration is, I'm going to explain it on this slide because I didn't understand the difference when I was revising for this, but transport maximum is when everything is fully saturated. All the channels don't, like, there's not a single channel that is left. However, threshold concentration just means that there are some nephrons that have more channels, more glucose channels, and have a better ability to reabsorb glucose back into the blood than other nephrons. This is symbolizing like a weak nephron with the glasses. Like it kind of looks bullyable, but this just means a weak nephron that doesn't have as much glucose channels as the next nephron. And what I mean by this is that this is usually when this nephron, this weak nephron, saturates all its channels. It doesn't have any more glucose channels that can reabsorb any more glucose. This is the exact moment where it excretes glucose into the urine. And now you can find glucose in the urine. So threshold concentration can come before transport maximum, just because transport maximum means when all of these nephrons are saturated. Threshold concentration just means the first instance where one nephron or a couple is saturated. And that's usually 200 what's it called? There has to be a plasma glucose concentration of 200 being filtered into the glomerulus through Bowman's capsule for it to show up in the urine. Does that make sense? And just to continue on that point, there are some high threshold substances, and this includes glucose. The most important one is glucose. Glucose is completely reabsorbed. High threshold substance just means that it's completely reabsorbed. Low threshold substances means substances that aren't as absorbed as glucose or amino acids, such as sodium. And no threshold substances, like substances that don't get reabsorbed at all, like urea and creatinine, are considered low threshold substances. Does that make sense? I can repeat this if anyone's confused. If not, I'll continue. Okay, I'm going to continue. Now, glucose titration curve. I want you guys to answer this, and I hope someone can answer this and chip in because that'd be really cool. But can anyone tell me which letter is the transport maximum? It'd be really awesome. Okay, I got a B. Anyone else? Okay, so actually, B is threshold concentration. B is at this point, what I mentioned before, at this point specifically. It's kind of tilted, but this is where B is. All right. C is actually transport maximum. C is this line. I kind of tricked you guys. I think it's C. Oh, you guys. No, wait, yeah, it is. Oh my God, Jenna, you're so correct. Yeah, you got it right. It's transport maximum. C is transport maximum. All right. So just to reiterate, in this slide I wrote it. B is threshold concentration. B is threshold concentration. It's the exact moment where glucose is seen in the urine. As you guys can see here in this graph, this is when excretion starts to start. This is when you start to see glucose in the urine. Because look, this is the excretion line and it's getting bigger. It starts. And this is what's it called, transport maximum, because this is the plateau I told you about. This plateau, let me reiterate this part. This plateau means that all of the glucose channels in your kidneys are saturated. They're already used. It's not going up because there's no more channels. This is why it curves and plateaus instead. Is that understood? It kind of looks like B is transport maximum because it's like pointing at this curve instead of like this exact line. I don't understand where the confusion is. And A is like a random point that she did. This is where the filtration starts to occur in Bowman's capsule to begin with. So A is the beginning of the filtration load. B is the threshold concentration, sorry. And C is the transport maximum. Is that understood? Because this is really important, and she mentioned specifically that she will test you on this. So I'd rather explain the time, like I take the time to explain this. Why see? Okay. Transport maximum just means, transport maximum just means that it's the point where it's the maximum reabsorption. And logically, this is the reabsorption. Ooh, let me get a different color. This is the reabsorption line, or this color. This is the reabsorption line. This is where it's showing you how much glucose is being reabsorbed. And this is the point where it stops going up. Now, if it was reabsorbing more glucose, it would be going up. However, it's not. This is the maximum point at which this kidney can reabsorb glucose. This is why it stops going up and instead curves, as you can see here. Does that make sense? This is why this line is transport maximum. Okay, perfect. Now, she mentioned something called splay, and splay just means like, why didn't this line directly like make a sharp U-turn, not U-turn, but sharp like not cross, like corner? Why didn't it just go like this instead of like curving? And this is for the reason I told you guys before. Not all nephrons can reabsorb glucose at the same rate. Some of them are weaker than others, some of them are stronger. And this is what they mean when they say heterogeneity of nephrons, because not all of them are built the same. Not all of them are the same. Heterogeneity just means they're different. And low affinity of glucose transporters, that just means that once they start to get saturated, they don't have a strong enough affinity to glucose as they previously did, because they're now all saturated and they have no room to reabsorb more. Is that understood? Because this is a really important graph. Just keep this in mind that this may be tested on, and I want you guys to know this completely. If all is good, I'll continue. Yes, transport maximum is due to transporters, like the saturation of transporters being entirely occupied. All of the transporters are occupied. Threshold just means it's the plasma glucose concentration that's being filtered through the glomerulus, and when it's first seen in the urine. Threshold just means it's the threshold at which, this is the threshold. This is 200. This is what threshold maximum, threshold concentration is. It's when it starts to be seen in the urine. And see, this is the excreted, and this is what threshold concentration is when you see glucose being excreted in the urine. And 200 is when it starts. Does that make sense? Yes, it's the exact moment, it's the exact number. Okay, let me re-explain this part. Threshold concentration is the plasma concentration of a solute, in this case glucose, at which it begins to be seen in the urine. So this would be the glomerulus, and this is the nephron. And at this point, 200 is the threshold. Let's for simplicity, I'll say let's say 30. 30 is a normal amount. It's being filtered through the nephron, and it's not being excreted because there's an abundance of channels that it didn't fill up. But 200 just means that there's so much glucose that it begins to affect one of the nephrons. As soon as one of the nephrons don't have enough channels to manage this amount of glucose, it will start to excrete glucose in the urine. So it's a specific amount of plasma glucose that's being filtered that will be seen in the urine, which is 200 milligrams per milliliter, I think. Okay, this is a really important concept. I'm going to explain this again. There's like a whole entire like revision section. I'll get back to this. And this is when you guys can tell me where you don't understand certain points. Okay, now we're going to be talking about glucosuria. Now, this is my little urine droplet that has glucose. It has a bunch of sugar, and this is the best way to imagine it because that's exactly what it is. Glucosuria just means that this is when you can find glucose in the urine. And when could you find glucose in the urine? By the way, this is entirely pathological. Pathological means unhealthy. Like you will never find a healthy individual that has a lot of glucose in their urine. And I'm going to explain why you would have glucose in your urine. Now, to begin, the reason why you'd have glucose in your urine is if you have lots of glucose in your plasma to begin with. If you have so much blood glucose levels, they're super high. And what kind of patient has super high plasma glucose levels? Patients with diabetes. And this is kind of like an interesting point, but like a long time ago when we didn't have machines to measure the glucose levels, doctors would literally taste the urine of patients to see if it's sweet. Because if a patient has sweet urine, then they have diabetes. And this is how they would, diagnose them. Kind of disgusting fact, but whatever, let's continue. And another reason why you'd have glucose in your urine is if you have a large GFR to begin with. If you have lots of plasma being filtered anyways, like it doesn't have to have a large amount of glucose, it could just be a large amount of plasma. And an example of this is in pregnant women. Just because pregnant women, their arteries and vessels, they vasodilate. So you have a large amount of plasma going through them. And the last issue where you could have glucosuria is congenital abnormalities. And this is specifically talking about the channels on the nephron. Now, if there's something wrong with your channels, then you can't effectively reabsorb glucose back into the blood. And this is when you'd have glucose in your urine because you don't have the channels to effectively reabsorb it back into the blood. Is this understood? Okay, I'll move on. All right. So you have like a whole slide that's called master glucose titration curve. And I want you guys to 100% get this because then again, it's going to come in the exam. Or maybe it's not going to come in the exam. Maybe she just wanted to say that to like scare you guys, but she emphasized on it a lot. So I'm going to emphasize on it a lot. Now, I want this kind of to be an interactive session. And if no one answers, I'll just answer it myself. It's fine. I understand this is maybe the first time you're learning this. It's okay. So can anyone tell me what are the meanings of glucose transport maximum and glucose threshold? I feel like this is where a lot of people got mixed up. If you want to mute your mic, that'd be cool. Kind of cool. Okay. Okay, I'm just gonna explain it. Glucose transport maximum just means the maximum reabsorption of glucose at a specific amount of time. So the maximum amount of glucose that could be reabsorbed in the entire kidney, because all of the channels are completely, is when transport maximum is when all the transporters are saturated, and threshold is the point at which glucose appears in the urine. Amazing. You did amazing, period. I mean, like, period, the dot. Amazing. Okay, that's exactly what that is. I'm going to reiterate. Glucose transport is the maximum amount of glucose that can be reabsorbed at a specific rate, and threshold is the plasma concentration of glucose that will be seen in the urine. The plasma concentration of glucose that's being filtered when it's seen in the urine. It's just threshold. Okay, now do they change in diabetic patients? Can anyone tell me a no or yes? That'd be cool. We could have a discussion, but I'll answer that. Okay, I got increases in a person with diabetes. Now, to be honest, the transport maximum and threshold concentration wouldn't change because these are kind of set values unless the diabetes ends up damaging the channels or damaging the nephrons or there's something wrong with the kidneys, then I think the glucose transport maximum and glucose threshold would decrease. Why? I'll explain why. Because if you have a less amount of channels to be saturated, then you're going to have a less amount of transport maximum. You're going to have less reabsorption. You're going to have less channels that could be saturated, if that makes sense. So both of them would decrease. The threshold at which you could see glucose in your urine would decrease. Because let's say that your nephrons aren't working, your channels aren't working, you don't have enough, they just don't work. And so therefore, it would take less sugar for it to be shown in the urine. Just a hypothetical. But honestly, I think the answer is no, they wouldn't decrease unless the nephrons were damaged in any sort of way. And what are the normal values? Can anyone tell me the normal values of transport maximum and threshold concentration? 375 for transport maximum or threshold concentration? Okay, threshold is 200. See, let me see, threshold. Yes, you do need to, they're actually really important. They're really easy. Like threshold is right over here as soon as the glucose is being excreted through the blood, no, excreted in the urine, this is when you call it threshold concentration. This is threshold concentration. Let me write that down. This is threshold concentration. This is transport maximum. So let me repeat this. Transport maximum is 375 and threshold concentration is 200 because threshold concentration would mean that you need 200 milligrams per milliliters of plasma glucose to be filtered through the glomerulus for it to be shown in the urine. Does that make sense? This is really important. I'm going to write this over here. Threshold, oopsies. Tm equals 375, and T, which is threshold concentration, is equal to 200. This is really important. Just so you guys see this on screen. Okay, can excretion of glucose exceed filtration? This is kind of logically thinking. Can excretion of glucose exceed filtration? What do you guys think? Okay, I'll answer it. Now, glucose can't exceed, yes, exactly. It can't exceed filtration. Why? Because what's being filtered through the Bowman's capsule is all that the glucose is, like all the plasma glucose that it's getting. How can you exceed the filtration? Especially since glucose is not secreted back into the tubules. Like, this is, I'm just going to draw it out for you guys. This is what it looks like. Right over here, as it's being secreted, so this is the glucose, it would be first reabsorbed, and it wouldn't be, no, not secreted. This is the blood vessel. It would be reabsorbed into the blood, and it can't be secreted back into the tubules. That's just common sense, I feel. The most important part, what you wanted you to understand from this is glucose doesn't get secreted into the urine. That's it. Okay. When is reabsorption of glucose equal to filtration? Does anyone know? I'll at threshold. You're onto something. Yes. Reabsorption is equal to what's it called? Reabsorption is equal to glucose filtration all over here. So what is this called? When it's below the transport maximum. Any number below the transport maximum is going to be equal to the reabsorption. This is what you wanted you to know. So over here is when it's below the transport maximum. And when does excretion of glucose exceed reabsorption? Does anyone know? Hey, I just answered it. It's at threshold. If you have something that's below threshold or above threshold, it has to be above the threshold for it to be excreted more than it's being reabsorbed. So the answer to when is reabsorption of glucose equal to filtration when it's below transport maximum, and when does excretion exceed reabsorption when it's above the threshold concentration? So above threshold concentration. You guys can go over this a couple of times because this graph is pretty important, but I'm going to move on for now. I'm going to explain this kind of quickly because she just added this, but what she meant over here is that urea is really filtered from the Bowman's capsule into the nephrons or the tubes. So it's freely filtered, and what she wanted to say is that when urea is in the tubular fluid, water passively diffuses from the tubular fluid into the blood. And this is just by the gradient. It's less water here and more water here, so just normal diffusion. And so since water is diffusing from tubular fluid to the blood or the plasma, there's a higher concentration of urea in comparison. So what does urea do? It just follows in suit. It follows, so like 50% of the urea is going to be reabsorbed into the blood. And that's basically all she wanted to say. It follows the same thing. Since there's more urea here and less urea here, it just follows simple diffusion the same way that water does. If anyone has any question on this, you can stop me. Okay, here's a question. Now, this was literally in your slides, and I just said, let me put it for the sake of completion, but what does the renal threshold for a solute denote? Can anyone answer this? Okay. Yes. C. Wonderful. Yes, the answer is C, plasma concentration at which a solute begins to appear. And I'll explain why the rest are wrong. Now, the reason why A is wrong is because renal threshold doesn't mean the filtration rate. It doesn't mean the rate at which the plasma glucose is being filtered, it means the specific plasma concentration. Okay, I'm going to write this over here. This means plasma concentration of glucose, not the filtration rate. What is maximum why is it not B? Because maximum reabsorption rate is literally just transport maximum. We already talked about this before. Maximum secretion rate, we didn't talk about secretion, and renal threshold is only for reabsorption. We didn't mention maximum secretion rate. And also, then again, it's a rate. It's not a certain concentration. And maximum tubular secretory capacity, it's just a random term that we never took. And we didn't really talk about secretory capacity. Okay, so this is a question that she solved with you in real time. And this uses like knowledge you took in previous lectures. So I'd want to explain this just because she explained this in your class. If anyone can answer this, that'd be awesome though. I'll wait a bit. I'll wait like a minute. Okay, I'm gonna start solving it. If you can answer it while I'm solving, that'd be awesome though. Okay, so she gave us all of these values, first of all. She gave us all of these values. And she wanted us to find the filtered load, the excretion rate, and the reabsorption rate. And what you can get from this question is that she just wants you to understand that some substances have a rate of reabsorption. So that's what this question is about. So how do you find filtered load? Filtered load is equal to plasma concentration, times GFR, all right? Excretion rate is equal to urine concentration times urine flow, so V. And reabsorption rate is equal to FL, which is filtration load, minus excretion rate. So if you plug in all the values that we just took, it's going to be 5 times 120 is equal to 600, and 1.5, or let me be, 60 times 1.5 is equal to 90. And the reabsorption rate is going to be equal to 600 minus 90. So the answer is 510 milligrams per minute. This is just the reabsorption rate. This is how you calculate it. And I wrote down all the answers, but I just wanted to do this for the sake of completion. Okay. So what you want to do to understand from this whole point or this whole lecture slide is that urea is freely filtered. So when you start off at Bowman's capsule, and this is the nephron. My nephron is really bad, but it's fine. This is the nephron, and urea is freely filtered. So it's filtered at the exact same rate. So right over here, urea in the urine, like what's being secreted into the nephrons, is exactly equal to the plasma urea that's being filtered. So what's coming from here is exactly the amount that's coming from here. That's what she wanted you to know from the first point. Tubular reabsorption of water, which is what I just mentioned, that water is just moving through, is being reabsorbed into the blood by diffusion. Like over here would be more water than over here, so it would just move by the gradient that it's supposed to move. And so since there's more water in the plasma, then there would be an increased concentration of urea in the tubular fluid. So if there's an increased concentration of urea, which is over here, intratubular urea is now increased. Now the urea just follows simple diffusion, once again, down the gradient. So since there's going to be more urea here, it's going to move from an area of high concentration to an area of lower concentration. Does that make sense? This is all she's saying. And approximately like 50% of the urea is reabsorbed here. So it's not reabsorbed as efficiently as water, but it's reabsorbed. Does that make sense? Is water more in plasma or tubular fluid? It's osmotically balanced, so it kind of just differs from area to area. So in this specific area, like hypothetically, what I'm talking about is that water is more over here in the beginning, if that makes sense. but water has to be kind of distributed everywhere in an osmotic balance. Does that make sense? But in this area specifically, in this area of the nephron. Okay. Okay. Now, this is just to relax. Does anyone have any questions about anything? Because we just finished P5. This is kind of the biggest bulk of your lecture. This is like 20 slides in, I think. Does anyone have any questions? Okay. I hope I got across to you guys. I didn't get the splay. Okay, I'll explain that again. Now, splay just means that there's a curve. And when I say splay, I'm going to explain it over here. Where did I not highlight it? Okay. So when she says splay, she just says, she brings the question, oh, why didn't it just go from this to this directly? Why did it have to curve? Okay. So when I mean like from this to this directly, I mean, why didn't it go like, why doesn't the graph look like this instead? The reason why the graph looks like this is because it takes time. It takes time for all the nephrons to be fully saturated, like all of the glucose channels to be fully saturated. It's not all of them just get saturated at once. This is why the splay occurs, because it takes time, because they're all different. They all have a certain rate of their channels being saturated, if that makes sense. And another reason is because the more glucose that's being reabsorbed into the blood, the less the glucose has an affinity to these channels. That's why it just slowly gets less and less and less. Now, if we had an infinite amount of channels, glucose channels in our kidneys, we just continue to go like this, along the filtered line, like this. However, we don't. And the splay just means that we have a limited amount of channels, and it takes time for them to all work at once. Does that make sense? Okay, I hope that made sense. Okay. You guys can ask me questions after the lecture if you have anything in specific. Okay. Now, we're going to be talking about the actual nephron, and this is more of a memorized based kind of understanding, but I'm going to try my best to help everyone memorize it because it's kind of hard. Actually, it's not hard. You know what? It's super easy. You guys are going to do great. All right. So first of all, we're going to start off with the proximal tubule. And as I said before, the nephron is split up into all these kinds, all of these different parts. So we're going to be talking about the proximal tubule in specific, right over here, the first part right after it's been filtered, okay? Now, what is the job of this proximal tubule? This proximal tubule is responsible for absorbing most of the water and the sodium. So most isoosmotic water reabsorption. Isoosmotic just means that it has the same amount of sodium and same amount of water, and it's all being reabsorbed. So when I mean reabsorbed, let me further clarify. There would be like a bunch of little blood vessels all around the nephron like this. So when I say reabsorbed, I mean going from the tubular fluid right here into the blood flow. Okay? So what's reabsorbed other than sodium and water? Oh, it's a good thing to talk about the fact that a constant amount is always being filtered in this specific part, exactly 60 to 70%. Now, what does this mean, 60, 70%? It means that other parts of the nephron can be regulated. Like, this is the only part of the nephron that has a consistent amount that always gets reabsorbed, okay? Like parts of the distal tubule right over here, I'm going to explain this further, so I hope don't focus on this too much, but this is just for an example. Parts of the distal tubule is regulated, so it doesn't absorb everything all at once. It's regulated, okay? So what is reabsorbed in the proximal tubule? Now, glucose is always reabsorbed in the proximal tubule, 100% of it. You can't find any glucose after the proximal tubule. And other than glucose, amino acids and bicarbonate. Now, amino acids and glucose are the only ones that are fully reabsorbed in this section of the nephron, in the nephron. Now, bicarbonate isn't entirely reabsorbed, and it will be reabsorbed in other parts. Glucose and amino acids are the only ones that are fully reabsorbed in the proximal tubule. Now, what's secreted? Now, things like toxins and hydrogen and biosalts are in like PAH. PAH stands for, I think, pararamic hydrogen. It's something, but PAH and creatinine are both secreted in the proximal tubule. Just because creatinine doesn't end up getting reabsorbed in the blood, like we talked about before, it's not reabsorbed. Okay, now we're going to be talking about this in specific. Proximal tubule, it has a bunch of different channels on the apical side and the basolateral side. And as we said before, apical would be right here and basolateral would be right here. I'm going to talk about each one in specific. Now, on the apical side of the early proximal tubule, you're going to have three channels. You're going to have a sodium-dependent glucose channel. You're going to have I'm going to explain this one after this one. Okay. Sodium-dependent glucose channel just means that it's using sodium's electrochemical gradient, and it's forcing it into the cell. It's like what we talked about before, secondary active transport. So sodium and glucose both get into the cell. And why I specified 1 is because she specified this in her lecture, that there's a 1 and there's a 2. We're talking about, okay, sorry, I skipped right ahead, but there's two kinds, not two kinds, but the proximal tubule is split up into two parts. So this would be the early proximal tubule, and this is the late proximal tubule. Right now, we're talking about this part, okay? So the early proximal tubule has 3 different channels on its apical membrane. It has a sodium-dependent glucose channel, like what we just talked about, and it has a different kind of channel. And for this channel in specific, I mentioned it over here, right over here. This channel isn't just one channel, by the way. I just wanted to compress it. These are like a bunch of channels that transport different things with sodium. So it would transport sodium and amino acids, and it would transport sodium and phosphates and sodium and lactates. And these are all different channels, by the way. I just wanted to turn it into one. And to know what exactly is being transported, X is being transported. And X is all of these things, okay? And lastly, the last one that we're going to talk about is the hydrogen sodium pump, okay? Now, on the basolateral membrane, we're going to be talking about the sodium and potassium ATPase pump. Now, why is this here? This is here in nearly all of the sections in the nephron. Why? This is what creates the electrochemical grade that the sodium needs to move, all right? So for the sodium to move into a cell, it has to have a lower concentration than outside of the cell. So the outside, which is the tubular fluid, would have a higher concentration, and it would see that there's less sodium, and it would move inside. And how do you make sure that the sodium stays inside of the cell? It stays in the side of the cell because the ATPase pump moves the sodium directly out of the cell as soon as it gets inside. Therefore, it maintains this electrochemical gradient and at all times. Therefore, there's always an electrochemical gradient in which sodium can use to transport other things like phosphate and glucose and amino acids. Another channel on the basolateral membrane of the cell in the early proximal tubule, that's like a mouthful, is GLUT1 and 2. Now, GLUT1 and 2 is just, it doesn't use sodium. It just transports glucose right outside of the cell and into the bloodstream. And lastly, this is another channel. This is not X because it doesn't transport the same things. This is very important. Now, this just transports different things like the amino acids and the phosphates and the lactates and all of them, they're already in the cell and they need a way to get out, okay? And this is the channel to take them out of the cell accompanied with sodium. However, I added something, and this is bicarbonate. Now, where did this bicarbonate come from? Dr. Angelica didn't explain this, so I'm going to explain this. I'm not too sure if you've taken this concept before, so I'm going to explain it. Now, when bicarbonate is filtered into the glomerulus, by the way, we're focusing here now. When bicarbonate is filtered through the Bowman's capsule and into the tubular lumen, bicarbonate cannot move into the cell by itself, okay? So what does it do? It accompanies and merges with hydrogen. And hydrogen, it turns into something called carbonic acid. And carbonic acid then is split into CO2 and water. And CO2 can passively go into the cell because it's lipophilic, so it can pass through the cell. And water can also pass through the cell using something called aquaporins, but forget about that. I'm going to explain that more later. So CO2 and water are now in the cell after they've been divided and, they came together with bicarbonate and hydrogen, and then they became something called carbonic acid, and then they split into CO2 and water. Okay, now they're both in the cell. What happens is they come together and they form carbonic acid again. And what happens is that carbonic acid splits by itself and it turns into hydrogen and bicarbonate. And this is how the cell gets bicarbonate. And this is how the nephrons get bicarbonate into the cell, because they don't have any bicarbonate channels, if you can see that. So I want to explain this in case someone had this question. They're like, oh, where did bicarbonate even come from? How did it come into the cell if it never even got reabsorbed? This is where it comes from. And Ca stands for something called carbonic anhydrase. And this is the enzyme that splits carbonic acid into CO2 and water. And this one just brings it together. And I didn't want to confuse you guys because she didn't go into detail with this, but just for your information, this is called carbonic, oops, this is way too big, carbonic anhydrase. All right. Now, this was a lot. Early proximal tubule is kind of a big bulk, but it gets easier. Don't worry. Okay. Now that we talked about the early proximal tubule, we're going to talk about the late proximal tubule, which is just the continuation of the proximal tubule. Okay, now in the part before, we were talking about sodium and we were talking about glucose and we were talking about amino acids. Now the main focus of the late proximal tubule is not all of these. Now it's chloride. Chloride is the most important thing that's getting reabsorbed back into the blood. It's only focus. Okay, so on the apical membrane of the cell, you see three transporters once again. Sorry, something that I forgot to explain here is that the reason why you have this whole pump is to provide the bicarbonate with this hydrogen so it can combine, if that makes sense. I thought that was pretty cool. Okay, so chloride is the main focus of the late proximal tubule. It has this glucose pump, and although the late proximal tubule isn't entirely responsible of reabsorbing glucose, it just helps with the last bits that the early proximal tubule couldn't get. Okay, and now the next channel is going to be something called the chloride anion antiporter. And when I say anion, here I put formate because that's what she put, and this is just one of the negatively charged ions that chloride uses to get into the cell. Okay, and lastly, just the what's it called? Ooh. This is just the other hydrogen sodium pump that's also used for the bicarbonate, by the way. Anyways, on the basolateral side of the membrane, you have a sodium potassium ATPase pump. And once again, this is for the electrochemical gradient. And this is just to balance it out. And of course, you need a channel to get the chloride out and into the blood so it can be reabsorbed. And this is what this passive facilitated chloride channel is for. Okay. And I wrote this all down here. But another way that sodium and chloride can be reabsorbed isn't only by the channels, it's also by paracellular transport. Now, this is really cool, but since a bunch of sodium is getting reabsorbed into the blood, sodium is positively charged, right? And then it creates a negative space in the tubular fluid. Since you're removing so much positive, it becomes negative inevitably. Okay, so what does chloride do? Chloride does end up transporting itself paracellularly because it's a negative ion, it's a negative molecule. It tries to make it less negative by moving itself away from it. Okay, but what does this inevitably happen? What does this inevitably cause? I keep saying inevitably. What does this cause? This makes this area more negative. So what does sodium do? It comes to the rescue. It goes from here to here paracellularly along with chloride and tries to make this area more positive. So it's a continuous balance between chloride and sodium that's balancing both the tubular fluid and plasma constant, what's it called? Electrochemical gradient. And this is what's so awesome because they're just making sure that each side is balanced by moving towards it, but actually they just keep on doing that. Anyways, I wrote this whole entire, wait. So does late have the same channels as early? No, it does not have the same channels as early. Late proximal tubule, as I said here, it's more concentrated on chloride. So it has more chloride channels, if you can see. Now, early proximal tubule has more glucose channels, has more amino acid channels, phosphate, it's mostly, it mostly focuses on sodium, glucose, amino acids, all of these molecules, and late proximal tubule is more for chloride, if that makes sense. And it just picks up like other glucose molecules that weren't reabsorbed in the early proximal tubule. Okay. Now that we're done with proximal tubule, does anyone have any questions for the proximal tubule? Just so we can stay up to date. I need to drink water. Okay. Now we're moving on to the distal tubule. Now the distal tubule, she also covers the collecting tubule, which is right over here. Ooh. So this is the distal tubule, and this is the collecting tubule, all right? And she covers both of them in the same thing because it kind of is. Distal tubule just reabsorbs and secretes, and this is what ends up becoming the urine. Whatever is secreted from here ends up becoming the urine. Okay, and the job of the distal tubule is to regulate things like sodium, potassium, calcium, and it also plays an important role in acid-base balance. Now, you're not going to learn this right now in detail. You're going to learn this in your next lectures, which are literally called acid-base balance. So that's not my job. That's for someone else to do. But it also regulates water reabsorption. Now, water reabsorption regulation is the key word over here, mostly because proximal tubule wasn't regulated. It just absorbed as much water as possible, which was 60 to 70%. But the difference is that distal tubule is regulated by hormones and different other aspects, but mostly hormonal. Like it's mostly water reabsorption by hormones. Okay, distal tubule is also split into early. I don't know why this is called proximal tubule. Yeah, this is okay. Wait, I'm gonna fix this, but this is the distal. Just keep this in mind. We're talking about distal tubule. This is a mistake. But the early distal tubule, they have a couple of transporters. They're not as refined as the proximal tubule, just mostly because the proximal tubule is in charge of reabsorbing mostly everything into the blood. But we're going to talk about the channels on the apical membrane and the basolateral membrane. Now, first of all, there's an NaCl pump or symporter. Symporter means to go with, like to go in the same direction. Antiporter means that they would be going in different directions. So one would be going here, one would be going here. So there's a sodium chloride symporter, and there's a calcium channel, and it's moving all of this in. And this is just basic knowledge, okay? You need the sodium potassium pump to regulate their electrochemical gradient, which is what we talked about before. If we don't have that, then there's no reason for the sodium to move in. And then there's no reason for the chloride to move in, okay? And then we have another pump, or what's it called? Calcium sodium symporter. And this is just moving calcium and sodium into the blood. And it's kind of logic. Like you want the sodium to go here, you want the sodium to go here, and you want the calcium to go here, and you don't want anything to accumulate. You just want everything to be reabsorbed into the blood. And it's really simple. And honestly, you guys are going to have to memorize the channels on each part of the nephron. So I hope I make it easier so I listed every single thing, whether it's apical or basolateral, but inevitably you guys are going to have to memorize this. I just wanted to make it easier for you to memorize. Okay, so this is my cat. Her name is Besbuas. She's still a she, but I wanted to do this because we're kind of almost done with the lecture, and I wanted to lighten the mood. So this is my cat Besbuas. But now we're going to be talking about the late distal tubule and the collecting duct, because the earlier distal tubule is kind of like, it kind of ends here, and the late distal tubule is over here, and it continues on to here. So that's what we're going to be talking about right now. Okay, so an overview of it, this is just an overview, but it's not permeable to water. There's actually no water that is getting secreted or reabsorbed in the distal tubule and collecting duct, unless a hormone acts on the nephron and it ends up inducing water reabsorption or water secretion. Now, what is the distal tubule and collecting duct made out of? Unlike the other parts of the nephron, it has specific cells that are for specific things. Now, two kinds of cells: principal cells and intercalated cells. And there's two types of intercalated cells. There's type A and there's type B. Now, what are principal cells? Now, what principal cells are mostly for is they reabsorb sodium and potassium. And this is really important when it comes to blood pressure, because these are the main ions that regulate blood pressure. And so lastly, like another reiteration, it's not permeable to water unless antidiuretic hormone, this is the hormones I was talking about. I said that they are not regulated unless hormones act upon them. This is antidiuretic hormone increases the ability of the distal tubule to reabsorb water. Where is this? Okay, and what are the intercalated cells for? Intercalated cells are more for acid-base balance because they deal with hydrogen and bicarbonate. Hydrogen is acidic and bicarbonate is alkaline. Alkaline just means basic. And so this is how this specific cell is more in charge of acid-base balance, but I'm still going to go over it. Okay, so this is really cool, but this is the late distal tubule collecting duct. This is the principal cells that we just talked about. What is not regulated unless hormones act on them? Okay, late distal tubules are regulated. They're regulated by hormones. Something that's not regulated at all and doesn't, like, if hormones act on them, it won't matter, is proximal tubule. The proximal tubule will reabsorb 60 to 70% of the water and sodium, as we said before, no matter what. That's the difference. Proximal convoluted tubules aren't regulated. It doesn't matter, but distal tubules are tightly regulated. Yeah, both parts of proximal. Just the proximal tubule in general. The distal tubule is the one that's regulated by hormones. Okay, perfect. Okay, so late distal tubule. This is really cool. So basically, there's a couple of channels. Principal cells reabsorb sodium and secrete, as mentioned in the slides. Yes, wait, this is exactly what I'm about to talk about. But yeah, you're right. This is literally what I'm about to talk about. Okay, so we're going to be talking about principal cells and what's on the apical side and basolateral side, all right? Now, you have three kinds of channels on the apical side, and you have the sodium, potassium, and chloride channels. And these are basically, this just allows for sodium reabsorption and potassium excretion or secretion. And this just enables chloride reabsorption. And on the basolateral side, you have an ATPase pump, as you do everywhere else, as I said. And once again, ATPase just controls the electrochemical gradient. Now, the cool thing about this is that there is a hormone called aldosterone, and you guys must have taken this in CVP or have taken this in renal. But what aldosterone does in this specific cell, what it does is it increases the amount of sodium channels inside of the cell. It increases the amount of sodium channels, it increases the amount of potassium channels, and increases the amount of ATPase channels. Now, what does this mean? What aldosterone does, and it increases the reabsorption of sodium in general. And when you have the increase of reabsorption in general, then you need to have a way to excrete it, or not excrete it, reabsorb it back into the blood just as efficiently, okay? So if you're increasing sodium, you need to increase the amount of ATPase so you don't have a buildup of sodium inside, okay? This is why aldosterone increases both of these. And the reason why it increases potassium is also because the ATPase channel pumps potassium inside. So you also need a way to get rid of potassium without it accumulating in the cell. Is that understood? We'll continue, okay? And the reason why you have a chloride pump is because, or channel, is because you're having all of this like, what's it called, sodium? Why does it increase? Okay, I'll re-explain this. It increases ATPase because it increases the amount of sodium channels. When you're increasing the amount of sodium channels, you need to have an efficient way to remove it out of the cell. Because if you don't remove it out of the cell, you're going to have an accumulation of sodium inside of a cell. And you know what happens when you have an accumulation of sodium inside the cell? Water begins to move in and it explodes. That's not what we want. We don't want an exploding cell. What we need is more ATPase pumps so we can get this sodium out of the cell without causing any other like concentration issues for the sodium. And the reason why ATPase, or the reason why it increases potassium channels, is because the potassium is getting out of the cell, right? But since ATPase is now increased and it's putting more potassium into the cell, it also needs to kick this potassium out. This is why it controls these three channels effectively. We want to get sodium out because the channels increased it at first. We want to get sodium out because the channels increased it at first. Yes, exactly. We want to get sodium out because what aldosterone does, it increases the amount of these channels. And if it increases one channel, it won't, like there would be lots of sodium in the cell, and you don't want a lot of sodium in the cell, so you just need to increase the amount of sodium that gets out. Is that understood? Okay, perfect. And as I was saying, since lots of sodium is coming out of the tubular fluid and into the cell, it's going to create a negative environment. So what does it do when it creates a negative environment? It has to get the negative out. So chloride has its own shuttle, just so it's not incredibly negative, and it kind of like balances. And by the way, there's a chloride channel on the other side, but she didn't write it, so I didn't. But just so you know, in the cell, there's always like harmony and there's always like continuing, if that's a word. It's always like balancing itself out. So there's a channel, I just didn't draw it, just to like efficiently get the chloride out. But she didn't do it, so I didn't. Okay. Okay. So I wrote here everything that's stimulated by aldosterone. All of these pumps are stimulated by aldosterone. And over here, she mentioned this briefly, but I'm going to mention it, that ADH, antidiuretic hormone, what I explained before, increases water permeability. So unless ADH is acting on the cell, it's not going to be permeable to that much water. All right? That's just the concept to know, that ADH increases water permeability. By how? Aquaporins. Aquaporins just make pores in the cell's membrane like this just to allow water to get inside. But she didn't specify, and I don't want to confuse you guys, so this is all you really need to know. And lastly, ANP. ANP is chloride used to increase negativity? Chloride is used to decrease negativity in the tubular fluid, right over here. You have a good idea to say that chloride would increase negativity on this side, but in this specific what's it called, image, where the channel is on the apical side, it decreases negativity because it's negative, so it's removing itself, and so it's therefore becoming positive. Does that make sense? Okay, I'm going to continue. But if it doesn't, I can get back to that. Anyways, ANP is just, it's called atrial natriuretic peptide. So it goes to cell from apical side. It moves from the apical side into the cell. Yeah, that's basically it. Yeah, it goes through the apical side. Okay. And she just mentioned the ANP. What it does is it decreases, what's it called? Sodium reabsorption. How does it do that? Or no, actually, ANP, all you guys have to know is that it decreases sodium's reabsorption. Aldosterone increases sodium reabsorption, ANP decreases it. That's all you guys have to know, okay? Lastly, this is a whole slide, but she mentioned that she won't be asking about the drugs, so I didn't want to get too specific, but Potassium-sparing diuretics, what they do is they inevitably just decrease sodium reabsorption. So how does this drug act on it? The potassium-sparing antidiuretics or diuretics, by the way, they're drugs. They're drugs that you take that affect your nephrons. Okay, so what would they do? They would inhibit aldosterone and they would inhibit ATPase. Because if you don't have aldosterone, you're not increasing the amount of sodium that's being reabsorbed. And if you don't have ATPase, you don't have the pump that reabsorbs the sodium back into the blood. That's basically it. She said she's not going to ask it, and you guys don't have to concern yourself with it for now. But later on, you will be taking pharmacology, and you will have to concern yourself with it. So for now, this is all you need to know. Okay. Lastly, the intercalated cells that we talked about. There were principal cells, and we talked about principal cells, and now we're talking about intercalated cells. There's two types of intercalated cells, and it's good because they're exactly like each other except opposite. I'm going to explain what I mean by that. Intercalated cells, what their whole point is, or type A. Type A specifically is to increase the excretion of hydrogen into the tubular fluid and out of the urine. At this point, you're looking at the collecting duct, by the way, because this is where the late distal tubule is throwing all its junk into. You're looking at the collecting tubule. So right here, collecting tubule. Okay. So the whole point of the intercalated cells, specifically type A, is to excrete hydrogen and to reabsorb bicarbonate, okay? And so the channels that are listed on the apical side are a hydrogen potassium ATPase pump and a hydrogen channel that moves directly into the tubular fluid, okay? And on the basolateral side, you have a bicarbonate and chloride pump or antiporter and a chloride channel. Okay. Now, the really cool thing about this is that, the really cool thing about this is that aldosterone has the ability to affect intercalated cells over here. Why? Because they're so close. They're really close to the principal cells in the late distal tubule, so they would act on these type A cells. So what happens when you have lots of aldosterone? What did we say aldosterone does? It increases the reabsorption of sodium, but what it also does is it increases the excretion of hydrogen. So what aldosterone would do, it would increase the amount of hydrogen, what's it called, ATPase pumps, and it would inevitably increase the amount of hydrogen in the urine. Okay, so hyperaldosteronism is a condition when you have lots of aldosterone in your body. And so the aldosterone would be working on this pump, to put as much as what's it called, hydrogen into the urine as possible. Or actually, all you guys have to know is that aldosterone just increases the amount of hydrogen in your urine. Therefore, something called metabolic alkalosis ends up occurring. Metabolic alkalosis it just means that now your blood is alkaline. And alkaline means basic. And when you're throwing all of this hydrogen into your urine, you're kind of depriving it of being in the blood where it's supposed to be. There's supposed to be a balanced amount of bicarbonate and hydrogen. So when you're throwing it all in the urine and you're throwing it out of your body, something called metabolic alkalosis occurs. And that's all you guys need to know, that when you have hyperaldosteronism, metabolic alkalosis can occur, or it would cause metabolic alkalosis. Okay. Now, late distal tubule and collecting duct, and the apical side has urine. Yes, this apical side has the tubular fluid, which at this point is urine. This whole thing that's going down is urine. You're concentrating the urine. But yeah, you're right. Okay. So now we're going to be talking about the intercalated cells type B. We just talked about type A. Now let's talk about type B. Wait, sorry. Sorry about that. Okay. So Now we're going to be looking at the type B cells, so intercalated cells type B. By the way, type A just means alpha and type B just means beta. So we're going to look at the apical side. And luckily for you guys, it's the exact same channels, just on the opposite side. And now what's happening is that it's throwing bicarbonate into the urine and it's reabsorbing hydrogen. It's literally the exact same thing, but opposite. It's not the same thing. The channels are on different sides. They're just opposite. So what's it called? Just to sum up, in intercalated cells type A, what happens is that hydrogen ends up getting excreted into the urine. And in intercalated cells type B, bicarbonate ends up getting excreted into the urine. All understood? Because now we're going to be talking about applications of this. We're like really close to the end, guys. Okay. Now, I'd want this to be pretty like interactive because I want to hear what you guys have to say. But what increases potassium secretion? Now, there's 4 things that increase potassium secretion. Can anyone tell me why high potassium diet would increase potassium secretion? I need to drink water. Okay. So if you have a high diet, it's just kind of common sense. If you have a high diet of potassium, you're going to be filtering more potassium into into the nephrons, and inevitably, it's just going to be excreted more into the urine. So that's exactly why. If you have more potassium in your blood, it's going to be filtered more, and then it's going to be excreted into the urine more. Okay. Now, why would hyperaldosteronism increase potassium secretion? This is a cool concept. This is super cool. Okay, I'm going to explain this. So in the late distal tubule and the intercalated cells, you know how we just said that aldosterone would increase hydrogen excretion? Now, it would increase the amount of this ATPase. Wait, I'm explaining on the wrong thing. No, sorry, wrong thing. I'm explaining on the wrong thing. You know how we just said aldosterone increases the amount of potassium pump or channels on the apical side? Forget this, sorry. No. Aldosterone increases the amount of potassium pumps in the principal cells in the late distal tubule. Okay, so if you have more aldosterone, lots of aldosterone, then you have so many potassium pumps, or I keep saying pumps, so many potassium channels that it ends up getting excreted into the urine at crazy, concentrations. So that's all. That lots of aldosterone would lead to lots of potassium, lots of aldosterone would lead to lots of potassium channels and lots of potassium in the tubular fluid. That's it. Okay. Alkalosis. Why does alkalosis cause potassium secretion? Alkalosis causes potassium secretion over here. Now, wait. Alkalosis causes potassium secretion. When you have metabolic alkalosis, we said that your body has lots of bicarbonate in your blood and not enough hydrogen. So how does your body compensate this? In CVP, you took lots of compensatory methods. So this is a compensatory method. This is what your body does to tackle this. What your body does is it increases the amount of ATPase, potassium hydrogen ATPase, so that increases the amount of hydrogen getting into your blood so it can manage your alkalosis. So while doing that, it ends up pushing lots of potassium into your cells, and your cells end up secreting potassium into the tubular fluid. And this is why lots of this is why alkalosis would increase the amount of secretion of potassium. And lastly, increased flow in the distal convoluted tubule. This is just the same thing. If you have an increased, oh no, this is not the same thing. Increased flow in the distal convoluted tubule just means that you have so much plasma running through the distal convoluted tubule like this. It's so fast and it's so much that it doesn't get the chance to be reabsorbed back into the blood. Now, all this potassium that's moving at a super fast rate ends up getting excreted. It doesn't get properly reabsorbed. This is why all of these reasons cause an increase in potassium secretion. Does anyone have any questions about this? Okay, I'm going to continue. All right. So this is just a sneak peek of your acid-base lecture, and I'm not too sure why she put this in the lecture, but it's fine. I'll explain it. So let's pretend this is a cell, okay? Let's pretend that this is your blood, and this is the what's it called? Intercellular fluid. So ICF for short. ICF. This is your ICF, and this is your blood. Now, when you have hyperkalemia is by definition, it means high levels of potassium in your blood. So high levels of potassium are getting shooted into your blood. This is a pump, by the way. This is like a symporter. So when you have high levels of potassium in your blood, inevitably your hydrogen is going to move into the cells, and this is going to cause acidosis within the cell. Now, once again, high levels of potassium is going to make the hydrogen move into the cell, causing acidosis. This is what this means. And when we look on this side, blood and ICF, when you have low levels of potassium in your blood, which is called hypokalemia, then all this potassium is going to move into your cell, and so the hydrogen is going to move out. Therefore, you're going to have alkalosis in this cell. This is all this means. This is all what this means. She just wanted to introduce the topic of like acid-base, concentration within cells. But that's it. Lastly, we're going to be talking about the hormones and how they affect sodium reabsorption. Now, we have 3 hormones, and these are pretty important, and I've mentioned 2 of them. This one's new, even though you guys know this. Now, aldosterone. What aldosterone does is it increases sodium reabsorption. We already knew this from the beginning when I said that aldosterone affects sodium reabsorption. It increases the amount of sodium channels, potassium channels, sodium, potassium, ATPase pump. And so where does it act? On the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting tubule, and it increases sodium reabsorption. ANP, if you guys remember, I said that ANP decreases sodium reabsorption, and it just combats aldosterone's effect. This is all it does, okay? And it also acts on the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct, and it decreases sodium reabsorption. Lastly, angiotensin II. You guys have taken this before, and if you guys know what angiotensin II does, it basically vasodilates the vessels. And when you have a vasodilation in the vessels, you're going to increase the amount of filtration in Bowman's capsule because you just have so much plasma going through the capsule that you have a lot of sodium going through the capsule. So where does angiotensin II act? It acts on the proximal convoluted tubule and increases sodium reabsorption. This is all this means. Now, question time. First of all, before we ask questions, does anyone have any actual questions about this? Anything? Okay, I'm going to continue with questions then. Now, why does alkalosis increase secretion in? Okay, so alkalosis, it doesn't directly, increase secretion. It's a compensatory method. And what does compensatory mean? It means that how does your body react to what's happening so it can bring it back to normal, so it can bring the blood levels back to normal. So over here, when you have metabolic alkalosis, it just means that your blood is super basic. It doesn't have enough hydrogen ions inside of it. So what does the body do? It increases this pump, ATPase pump, potassium hydrogen pump, and it increases it so more hydrogen can go into the blood and it can make or balance out the alkaline levels of the blood. So that's essentially what it does. That's the compensatory method. That's why hydrogen is getting dumped into the blood. But what happens as a result of this? It increases the amount of potassium inside of the cell. So where does the potassium go? It ends up getting excreted in the tubular fluid. And this is why increasing this to increase the amount of hydrogen in the blood so it can combat metabolic alkalosis increases potassium inside of the cell and then dumps the potassium into the tubular fluid. Does this make sense? It's not a direct reaction. Perfect. Alhamdulillah. Okay, question time. Which of the following tends to okay, this is supposed to be down here, but whatever. Which of the following tends to decrease potassium secretion by the cortical collecting tubule? By the way, cortical collecting tubule means collecting duct, if I refer to it. It's part of the distal tubule. So which one increases it? Or I mean decreases potassium secretion? Can anyone take a guess? C, a diuretic that inhibits the action of aldosterone. Anyone else? Okay, C is correct. A diuretic that inhibits the action of aldosterone. Aldosterone, just to revise, aldosterone increases the amount of sodium channels. So if you have less aldosterone, if you have a drug that takes away this aldosterone, you'll have less sodium and less sodium being reabsorbed back into the blood. So yeah, or no, I mean, sorry. I thought this was sodium. If you have less aldosterone, you'll have less potassium being secreted into the urine because you have less potassium channels. Sorry, wrong thing. Aldosterone, potassium, and increases the amount of potassium in the tubular fluid, which decreases the potassium secretion rate. Okay. Which of the following would be expected to cause a decrease in extracellular fluid potassium concentration, hypokalemia, at least in part by stimulating potassium uptake into the cell? Does anyone know what this is? Okay. So the answer is metabolic alkalosis. Yes, perfect. You're right. It is metabolic alkalosis. And this is just because this is what we talked about, that this is in this slide. Metabolic alkalosis. Is this the same thing? Yes. Metabolic alkalosis would in turn decrease the amount of potassium inside of the extracellular fluid. So it would move from the extracellular fluid to the intercellular fluid. That's it. Okay. This is the end. Okay. In which portion of the nephron labeled on this will the tubular fluid osmolality remain constant in the presence or absence of ADH? This is also ADH. A. Yes, perfect. This is the proximal tubule, and this is what we were talking about this entire time. Okay, I'll explain why it's not D. But the proximal tubule is the only one that's going to remain, the reabsorption of water is going to remain consistent throughout the entire nephron. Like out of the entire nephron, the proximal tubule is the only one that will reabsorb water at a constant rate and won't be affected by ADH. The answer is A, and I'll explain why it's not D. D is, what's it called? The distal convoluted tubule. And as I said before, the distal convoluted tubule is the one that's most likely to be regulated by hormones such as aldosterone. But didn't you say unless a hormone works on? No. What I said is that the proximal tubule does not get affected by hormones. It only gets affected by angiotensin and not directly because angiotensin increases the plasma flow that's being, what's it called, filtered through the Bowman's capsule. So just to repeat, I want you guys to really understand this. Proximal tubule, it's not affected by hormones. No matter what, the proximal tubule will always reabsorb 60 to 70% of sodium and water, always, whether or not a hormone is there. But the distal convoluted tubule is affected by hormones. It is affected by antidiuretic hormone, which is ADH, and affected by aldosterone. It's the most susceptible to any kind of hormone change. And that's why we said it's regulated. Okay, alhamdulillah. Okay, we're finally done. And this was a pretty long lecture. And I'm really glad you guys stayed with me for all of this. But If you guys have any other questions, I can stick around. But for now, thank you so much. And this is my cat. And you guys should scan this and do a feedback form. But yeah, if you have any other questions, you guys can call me, not call me, like text me. You guys can call me or text me or email me. No problem. Does anyone have any other questions? I can still answer afterwards, since we're done. If no questions, then perfect.